2022 has been a very interesting year for Elite Dangerous, to say the least. There's been a bunch of highs as well as an unfortunate number of lows. All in though, it's been a much better year than the disaster of 2021, but let's not focus on that as we are moving forward with the game and into the future. Let's start with a high. The first real high came with Update 11 back in the early parts of 2022. This, of course, included the fleet carrier interiors. Whilst a lot of people are still hopeful that eventually they'll be able to walk around inside their ships, nonetheless they can now walk around inside their megalith fleet carriers. Huge, gigantic vessels they can use as mobile bases of operations, whether they're in the bubble of humanity, fighting the new Thargoid war, or on the far side of the galaxy. Fleet carrier interiors then finally gave players an area they could call home, somewhere that is theirs, that they own, that they can even carry with them. Very nice update. Unfortunately, there was a low around about the same time. This is obviously the biggest low of the year, and perhaps one of the biggest low of all times for Elite Dangerous. That, quite naturally, was the unfortunate cancellation of all development of Elite Dangerous on consoles. Development for the game now on Xbox and PlayStation is limited purely to security updates and other essential fixes. It means that, unfortunately, console players are now cut off from the best parts of the game, the best new parts that is, the ongoing updates as well as the new developing narrative. Whilst console players can still very much play the game, and there is still a full living galaxy here, one with its very own background simulation no less, unfortunately there's no live updates, nothing such as community goals or anything like that. Now there is an area here I'd like to consider a high, but it seems a bit disingenuous to consider this a high after the fact that, well, consoles were cancelled after all. And that was for a limited time. Frontier did allow the ability for players to fully transfer pretty much everything from their console over to a PC save. Additionally, if you owned Elite Dangerous on consoles, Frontier were decent enough to give you a free copy of Horizons on PC once you completed the transfer. That transfer window has now closed. You're no longer able to do that, so if you've missed out, that is a bit of a sad state of affairs. But the transfer will be returning at some point in the future, although no date on that has yet been given. Another point there, though, somewhat of a low, is that when the transfer does return, it will be in a limited form. It will no longer be in the full form that we once had access to. Now moving on to a high. This was the conclusion to the AZIMUTH saga, a story which had been unfolding over a very long time. Now, as with tradition with Elite, much of that story took place outside of the game in the form of text posts over on the Galnet website. But that changed with Update 13, which brought the narrative directly into the game, both in the form of the first ever in-game cutscene, as well as, a full-on star system effectively getting annihilated. This all came about thanks to the saviour of humanity, a character called Salvation. He attempted to fire a super weapon that would once and for all deal with the threat of the Thargoids. That backfired, didn't it, and left humanity in the lurch, and giving birth to a new breed of effective super Thargoids that are immune to Guardian weapons. This was a foreshadowing of events to come at a later date when more Thargoids would turn up who also proved to be immune to these weapons. Whilst it's true to say that the vast majority of Thargoids, you can still use the Guardian weapons as well as pretty much any other anti-Xeno weaponry on them inside certain star systems, more on that in a minute, those weapons will prove problematic. But yeah, very much a high Update 13 and the conclusion of the AZIMUTH saga. Now this of course all led into a war, which was a part of Update 14. Update 14 is a high, we'll get to that in just a moment, but there is a small low with Update 14 and I do want to include here as a low because, I still personally think it's a bit of a strange design decision. And that is the fact that all war efforts reset after a period of 7 days. Now the good news is that Frontier have adjusted the in-game balance here, the stats, the numbers, and made it somewhat easier for players to reach the desired state to try and avoid this reset. So whilst it's now barely an inconvenience, it still is a little bit of an inconvenience, but yeah, it's just the way the game works. Not ideal, but for the most part it's not really a problem now. So yes, a very minor low, but one I wanted to include in there nonetheless. Now moving on, a high and a low combined here. This is the release of what Frontier called a Legacy Mode and Live Mode. This is a high because it now gives players a choice as to how they want to play Elite Dangerous. They can stick with Horizons version 3.8 and play Elite as it always existed up until the release of Odyssey. It means that these players can exist within a world that is unaffected by the threat of the Thargoid War. It means there's no changes here that affected Odyssey, and it contains all the original graphics that Horizons did contain. Additionally, players can stick with Legacy Mode and have a completely independent save that doesn't affect anything they do in Live Mode. So this is definitely a high. The only reason it's a low is for a number of reasons. Firstly, it really does emphasize that console users are once and for all fully cut off from any future in Elite Dangerous. Additionally, it really does further split the player base. Now, I fully agree with anyone here that I am really stretching at that point. I don't think it's too much of an issue, but looking around the internet, there's plenty of people who do feel it is an issue, so I wanted to include that here as a bit of a low just for them. All in though, I think that the release of Live Mode and Legacy Mode are definitely a bit of a high point and really show Frontier's commitment to pushing Elite forward over the coming months and over the coming years. And finally, the biggest high of the year is without doubt Update 14. This is the Thargoid War, something that we've been waiting for many years if you're a long-time player of Elite Dangerous, something that has always been on the fringes, something that players have long speculated about, but they're finally here and they are slowly but surely attacking and destroying parts of civilization. All of this has perhaps united players like never before as they are collaborating and fighting back, pushing the Thargoids out system after system, eventually perhaps coming face to face with the centre of these disasters known as the Maelstroms. 8 of these exist. Currently, as of this recording, we don't know what exists inside of those, although a number of people are speculating. But whether or not that speculation turns out to be true or entirely unfounded, it's going to be a while until we actually know for sure. Nevertheless, Update 14, whilst not really delivering a brand new content to the game, did deliver entirely brand new conditions, and these tie all older existing content together in a very interesting and very impressive way. Ultimately, if you're not a fan of combat, you're not a fan of being interdicted all the time, you may have some problems with the nature of these new content and new conditions. I certainly feel that way myself, but overall, definitely Update 14 is a great addition to Elite Dangerous. Do let me know in the comments section below what you feel about all of this. What are your personal highs and lows for Elite Dangerous in 2022? Specifically regarding content released from Frontier and changes they have made or perhaps haven't made to the game. Meanwhile, if you're enjoying space games and are wondering where to go next with the space-themed games, then why not check out the video on the screen right here. In here I talk about space games that are not necessarily flying about with spaceships, but are instead some very high quality sci-fi space-themed games. Do check it out, the link's right here.